Good evening and welcome to NycosRPG. I'm your host, Jonathan Albin, and today we have 10 more topics for tomorrow that are timely, that are going to be covered by the talking heads of the games industry and beyond, bringing to point things that haven't yet crossed their line of sight, so to speak. So before we get into it, go ahead and go below and click all the buttons to let the algorithm know that you're part of our audience. Like, share, and of course, subscribe to the channel because that'll really help us to get the word out to more and more people.
Absorbing damage is the name of the game. From the claws of monsters or the heat from a ball of flame, or strength in numbers is a roll of the dice.
Alrighty, so we're going to be talking about what may be the rise and fall of RPGs in general and of the particulars of the big boys of our time, Dungeons and Dragons, Pathfinder, and the like. But we're actually going to be looking at this with an air of optimism. We're going to be talking about particular topics that specifically point out where the weaknesses in the older classic role-play game systems and the glaring errors that are in the newer upcoming ones, so that we can kind of get a handle on what really should be, what the future of Nykos and other role-playing game systems of the future should work out to be. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the ironic advance of contrivance. Now, this term may not be standard to you and you may not have heard such a thing, but in the ancient past, back in my day, in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, game masters were saddled with the burden of providing material for the players in such a way that the players didn't feel like they were being guided or handheld along the way. If they were a game master who tried to manipulate or control the game, they were considered to be railroaders. The idea that the story had already been constructed and that the player's portion was relegated to them by the game master and therefore not as enjoyable. Whereas a more competent game master, a more awakened one, shall we say, would be a sandbox game master, providing a framework for the world, but then merely acting as a judge and guide as necessary. The irony here is that the concept was that the story production would be therefore more personal and emotionally connected for the player if they were the ones themselves who put themselves into such states. And the irony is that this meant that the player contribution was much heavier, much deeper, and they had themselves to be more involved. And the challenge is, of course, when you do that, when the player is the one doing it, then there is no real indication of the value of the story to anyone other than the players. And so the wheel has come full circle, so to speak, to the point now where the game mechanisms are actually driving emotional conditioning built into the mechanism. As I stated in my recent Daggerheart review, the emotional state, the break between hope and fear, was a way of conveying to the players when it was okay for them to care, when it was okay for them to become emotive, and therefore they were being established in a contrived environment. They weren't actually, there wasn't a first mover, so to speak, in the culture. Instead, it was a draw to a conclusion instigated by the game master and then fomented by the dice rolls in order to cause the emotional state to occur. It wasn't a situation where they were actually feeling it, but they were compelled to portray the feeling thereof. And that, to me, is an indicator that the story has come full circle, where the players are now wanting to be guided and directed in their emotional state within the game. And I think this is going to be a topic for discussion among the talking heads, if you will, of the game's business, because as we begin to explore the relative merit of this, we begin to see how false it is and how that contrivance actually takes away agency instead of providing it for the players themselves. Now, I also see a major change coming in the next few months, years, sessions, I suppose, wherein the session size will shrink. The simplicity of the newer role-playing systems that are being couched together as fundamentally OSR products, these old system review systems are themselves oversimplifying the rules, or that may actually be what OSR stands for, but oversimplified rules. But the idea is that there is less work to be done to build a character, therefore there's less development time in the engagement phase of the game. Wow, I'm sorry, apologizing again for my camera. I don't know why it is acting thus and such. That's just not normal. Okay. Anyway, the idea that a session itself may become a smaller bite-sized portion of what might have been expended in the past is a artifact, I believe, of the process of role-playing. The idea that a game session of 2, 3, 4, 5 hours is becoming more unpalatable, and the idea of having a session that runs for 1 to 2 hours, covers maybe 2 or 3 encounters, and you're done with the session for the week, I believe is going to be a sort of a benchmark, and there will be those that will be sitting in their ivory towers and pontificating on whether the length of the adventure matters or not. And the other issue is that they are also increasingly looking at role play as a perhaps solo encounter or 1v1. And while it is possible, and there were instances where such have occurred in the past, they were not by and large the desirable size. And I think this shrinkage is going to be a disservice to the greater, deeper stories. Of course, with the reading propensities of people today, this has already somewhat threatened the actual number of people, for example, that have read the entirety of The Lord of the Rings. Of course, this is conjecture, but I believe been seriously curtailed by the lack of patience that people now have about the time they invest in reading. And so if even a storybook is being required to be shortened and spoon-fed and simplified, that same thing is going to be happening to games groups. And I would put dollars to donuts that the privileged few in the tabletop RPG system who pick up on these trends will be utilizing this as a talking point in the near future. You'll see videos about how to shorten your adventure or how to decomplexify it further. With the shortening of sessions and the simplifications of rules mechanisms, the concept of interacting with NPCs in the story is going to decline in value. As a matter of fact, that's one of the functions of the Nykos mechanism for non-enjoined persons, to actually identify them and see them as individual people who have a life pattern and a structure to their lives, and to curtail the use of them as just a plot device. And I think this further is somewhat carried forth in the amount of humor videos that are being made about NPCs. And I think you're going to see that sort of form of humor become less direct because fewer people are aware of what an NPC really is or what they are representing. And as the NPCs decline in value, the stories, therefore, have to become less complex because you're not having as many moving parts. You've got fewer engagements in your sessions that are not combat or are not specifically tied to the story elements, and therefore they are flattened. And this concept of the non-player character becoming more useless fundamentally will mean that the resources that players utilize will be less in terms of their capability for communication and more on their resource access through other things like library skills or reading or mechanical things that can be resolved with a dice roll. Now, there is a catch-22 in this concept, and that is we need to gather additional increasing amounts of information in smaller bites. And this complexity means that the nomenclature, the conversational mechanisms will increase in complexity, but the way that the role-playing game session matches or mirrors reality is going to become less and less. So you will be, instead of having a conversation, a dialogue between yourself and NPCs, instead you will be working with the game master through a series of mathematical equations and die rolls that will approximate that communication. And since it is not an actual narrative, it will not require narrative. And this shifting of the complexity of the game through these various catch-22 mechanisms will make the conversations about games no longer really about the depth of the personas or the intensity of the scenes, but merely a binary discussion about the very mechanics of how the game accomplishes these tasks. And this, in turn, will leave the game session feeling flatter, while the people who will be discussing it will have more to discuss, so to speak. There'll be more engagement in terms of how the mechanic works, so that it isn't so much what the story is about, but what the players perceive about the mechanism that the story utilizes to accomplish those tasks that are now being replaced. Of course, this leads to the challenge of a one-size-fits-all system. And while NycosRPG could be lumped in there alongside basic universal role-playing games or generic universal role-playing systems, these one-size-fits-all mechanisms are becoming a challenge because there are a lot of stories that people want to tell that they're not able to because the mechanisms don't embrace the particulars of how action occurs within those stories. And this one-size-fits-all challenge has left a lot of players with a kind of a sour taste in their mouth for a one-size-fits-all system. So where that departs in terms of NycosRPG is that the mechanisms allow for the storyteller to build a complexity in as they desire and provides an oversight mechanism that allows for the method for communication to be as narrowly defined or as broadly defined as the storyteller wishes. And this challenge, I think, will be brought up by the talking heads as they discuss how difficult it is to tell, for example, a survivor's story within a mechanism that doesn't actually provide any threat to life, and therefore the concept of running a survival game will vanish fundamentally, and therefore the talking heads will be speaking more to the idea of what we have left versus how to embrace those stories that have been lost. There's also an issue of systemic snow blindness in most systems, because once you get familiar with how the mechanism works, you adapt your story mechanism, you adapt your storytelling to match the mechanism, but in that process you also lose a lot of the breadth and depth you might have had otherwise. And the idea that, for example, a story told in a mothership environment almost demands to have a horror aspect, simply because most of the mechanisms in that game are set up to take advantage of those tropes, and trying to find a way to tell other types of stories within the same framework will lead the players astray and leave them feeling dissatisfied. And I think there will be conversations over the months that talk about this, in particular how to overcome this snow blindness and how to regain a focus within the framework that isn't directly associated with the mechanisms thereof. Also, when you're talking about role-playing games, historically, and because of the video games aspect that has become so much a part of the role-play experience, that the delineation between rewards for accomplishments within the story and treasures that were unearthed by the activity will soon be lost in terms of the lines. This even happens within my own game. We had a recent session where the players happened upon a place where, after defeating a monster, there were several large containers of materials. And the players, because they had just finished this monstrous defeat, were going through the materials in the boxes, and while they were valuable, while they did have story merit and they also had economic transfer value, they were not specifically items that would normally be considered rewards. The idea, therefore, that the villains had boxes and boxes of things that were easily tradable and had a street value was actually underwhelming to the group, because the players were expecting to have access to resources that would amplify their abilities and increase their capacity to continue to advance down the processes that they were looking for. And it was an interesting situation, because there was clear disappointment among the players, because they expected find additional weapons for themselves or additional gear that would modify them. But that made no sense in terms of what the villains would be keeping the items for. So the idea of having a way to reward the players needs to be kept separate from the street treasure, so to speak, that they gather, because the players have this weird dichotomy of assuming that a successful run will give them additional things to improve their ability to make more successful runs, instead of seeing it as possibly an in-story element that will draw them further down the rabbit hole of the story that you're telling. There's also going to be a increasing discussion about the relevance of rules lawyers. In the past, the value of someone who had a serious handle on the mechanisms of a game was important, because you were trying to make sure that your other players quickly caught on to what was going on in the game session. and having, whether they were rules lawyers, rules advocates, just familiar faces that knew how the game worked, has become less of an important thing because the nature of the OSR, the idea of the single shot and the standalone session, has so amplified that there's not really a value to expending your knowledge base into the rules mechanism. Not only because you don't necessarily play that same game week over week now, but also because the storytellers themselves are going to place interpretations on the rules to suit their purposes for the single shot. And so the very strength of your loyal player who knows the mechanism is fundamentally going to be sliding to the wayside. And I believe a lot of the pundits in the games business are going to be discussing whether or not this is a positive or negative impact on gameplay overall, and how the rules lawyers ecosystem can be adapted or adjusted in coming years because of these changes in the way people play. Now, on the other hand, I do need to specify that innovation is an open field. If you are a creative game master and you build a system, whether it be within the OSR or in the one-shot mechanisms of today's world, you are still a valid resource. And this innovation in this opening and burgeoning environment really does give an opportunity for new game systems and new mechanisms to become available. And there's nothing more exciting than to see players grab a hold of a new mechanism and make it their own. Now, of course, this flies in the face of the fact that there are now creativity killers out there. I've already seen properties that fundamentally isolate a mechanism of role play down to a one session piece that basically undermines the rest of the marketplace because they are focusing on the context of the engagement and therefore deconstructing role play at a session by session level. And this advent is going to be, I think, discussed quite a bit as players begin to see that their creativity is becoming irrelevant because they're not given enough of a scope in the one-shot adventure to really push those envelopes and express themselves. And I think that this push towards the one-shot single scenario is itself going to find feedback among the players that will be the opposite, that will be guiding us back towards a hopefully expansive multi-session world view in coming months. So, of course, the question that I lay out to you is, what do you see in the future? Are these topics that I'm discussing relevant? Do you see how these could become topical hills upon which to die if you are a games aficionado? And if you realize that every game master is being provided more and more freedoms, there are actually fewer and fewer game masters that can embrace this liberally expansive new world because there are so many pitfalls and traps that are inherent in the system. So what would be your take? Share with us below in the comments section what you would see for the future. And if you agree with me on a few of these, call those out because I'd love to see where you guys see the world going in the future. I am here 5 nights a week. I'm Jonathan Albin, and this has been NycosRPG. I hope you have a great time, and why don't we all just play?